Good morning, everybody. So one of the great changes or transformations in the 21st century has been the collapse of the American hegemony and the rise of China as the second great superpower. This is all well, good, and fine, or at least it would be if China and the United States shared all of the same values. The problem is they do not. And one of the concerns that the US and many other countries around the world has is the human rights record in China. Both what that means for how they treat their own people, but also what it means for the rest of the world as China's influence begins to expand out of Asia into Africa and takes root in South America. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Sean Williams, and I am the lead professor of political science and the director of the Kentucky Heartland Institute on Public Policy here at Campbellsville University. I am joined today by three of our excellent scholars to talk about China and human rights, and more specifically, to discuss whether or not the West or the rest should intervene in China in an attempt to change their human rights behavior. As they appear on my screen, I'm joined by Bethany Davis. Ms. Davis, thank you for joining me. I have Luke Glasscock. And lastly, but not leastly, Carly O'Neill. Good morning, everyone. How are y'all today?
Morning. Good.
So let's get started. We have a lot of terms that we should probably talk through for the average viewer who may not be familiar with them before we dig into the heart of the foreign policy question. The first one is I use this phrase human rights. What exactly are human rights? What exactly does that mean?
So I have a definition, in which it says that human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of their race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. And these rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and there's many more. Everyone is supposed to be entitled to these rights too without discrimination. And they aren't granted by any state, but are supposed to be inherent just because we are all human and these are human rights. Including these is the right to marriage and family, the right to freedom of thought and expression, the freedom of democracy, the right to public assembly, the right to life, the right of freedom of thought and religion, and many more.
Of what it means to be to have rights. Should we think of human rights as being something that are universally defined in the way that you seem to suggest that every person has it? Or should we kind of walk that back a little bit and talk about how different cultures might have different definitions of human rights?
I don't think so. I did a lot of research concerning mainly the UN and the Human Rights Declaration. And the Human Rights Declaration, it protects freedom, justice, peace, discrimination against gender, religion, race, where you're born, your status in the world. And, this is part of something that numerous countries have signed, even ones that you might think have different cultures: Russia, China, the United States, multiple African countries, just dozens of countries that we would generally think of having much different cultures than the other. And they've all signed this form that dedicates these things to all being universal human rights that everyone has. So I definitely don't think it's just a individual basis on what human rights are.
I think that's a really interesting perspective, especially when it comes to like freedom of religion and how that's protected by certain states. One example I found really interesting that's not necessarily related to China, but as we can see like how these rights would differ in other states is, in my experience living in Malaysia, Muslims who are born in Malaysia are required to follow Islam, and they can't change that religion. So even though we might see it as a universal human right, as a protection to practice whatever religion you might want to, there's some states in which people can't choose that, and that right that the UN might declare as a universal human right differs culturally. So if you're born as a Malay person in Malaysia, you are required to follow Islam, whereas other people who are born in Malaysia, like Chinese people, they don't have to follow that same standard.
Yeah, that's actually a really great example. You have the freedom to practice the religion that you choose, but if by culture or by law I only recognize the existence of one religion, and I believe that all others are false religions or false beliefs, giving you the right to practice religion limits you to the right to practice Islam. And that seems like it's a sort of a cultural trap where I can agree to sign a document with you using terms because we disagree on the definitions of those terms. I've defined them in my language and you've defined them in yours. So whenever we think about that list that you were going over a second ago, Ms. Davis, about what exactly are human rights, we broadly categorize them in 4 different ways. And so I don't know which one of these. I'm going to give you a list of possible categories. And I'm going to ask you if you think that one or all of these should be considered to be a human right that is universal and universally understood. Okay, so first of all, bodily integrity. Do you think that every culture in the world would have the same definition of bodily integrity as a human right? Can that be considered universal?
I think that can definitely heavily be debated, because as I was researching bodily integrity itself, it's just emphasizes the importance of your personal autonomy and your self-ownership, determining just about yourself and having the freedom to make decisions over your own body. And I think while some states respect this, I don't think that human rights necessarily fit into this category, because I feel like the rules and regulations that are over that change so much depending on the culture. So I don't necessarily think that bodily integrity is what human rights would necessarily fit into. But I think, Luke, you were about to say something.
I would say that sort of we can look at this through like different states based on sort of like where they are in development, like their development index. And I would say as they become more developed, it's important at the base level to have some of these categories, like they have to be. And as they develop, they're more likely to have some of these other categories, such as bodily integrity and just various other things. But I would say that at the base level, even states that are like just starting in development towards more democracy or whatever, there are certain things that you have to have. And as they develop, they will gain these other things, such as bodily integrity. But I don't know exactly which one is like the most important or like the most like basic of the human rights. But I would say probably just being able to have like access to like necessities like shelter, food, water, these kinds of things, and like just overall like health sort of issues, I would say are like the most like baseline important. And then you kind of like work your way up like sort of like a pyramid, I guess.
Okay. So then the things that a body needs to survive might fall into the category of human rights without us getting into a thorny debate over something like the debate we're having in the United States for the last 70 years of abortion, where I'm debating over the right of the fetus to live versus the right of the woman to control her own body. Which one of these entities has the greatest claim to human rights? Okay, so what about something like freedom of conscience? So the idea that I get to, I guess freedom of religion was one that you'd mentioned, but the idea that I have freedom of political speech, or that I have the right to oppose the government or something. Would you consider freedom of conscience to be something like a fundamental human right?
I would consider it to be, your governments aren't going to develop and become better if people aren't allowed to like have an input in what they want. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the people want to have certain freedoms. Like they may actually support a certain religious ideal, and that's fine if that's what they want. And so ultimately, it's very important as far as becoming better development wise towards like everyone having more of a say, to have the ability to have input in your government. But also it's important as countries are developing and as they become more democratic to note that that isn't necessarily an increase in human rights, because ultimately human rights protections are often for the minority of people and not necessarily what the majority, or like in a democratic sense, what the people necessarily want.
I would say that freedom of conscience, I think, is definitely important when looking at human rights, because, like, for example, in China, when they're pushing back against Hong Kong or don't have the ability to kind of gather politically or be able to say anything negative against the government, in other countries we see this as well. I think that this does create a big violation of human rights, and I think it is definitely under a category of that, because if they don't have the right to kind of make their issues heard, or if the government is treating them unfairly, especially as Luke said, especially minorities, like China's detainment of Muslims and in the concentration camps. And I think being able to talk about how the government is not treating them fairly and not being able to do this is definitely a big violation of human rights.
A second ago, Luke, you alluded to the fact that freedom of conscience was a problem because the society or the government needed competing ideas in order to develop. But that suggests that freedom of conscience is much more of a group right than an individual right. Do you think that something like group membership or group identity should be considered a human right? The fact that I can belong to an ethnic group, and my ethnic group has the right to survive, or my community or my family has the rights, maybe that extend beyond me as an individual, or should human rights simply be an individual focus?
I would say human rights start as sort of looking at the individual, like base level. But again, freedom of association is sort of a big thing. As Bethany mentioned, the Uyghur population in China, that would be like sort of a group identity, a religious identity. And so their human rights are being violated on the basis of an identity that they share. If they identified with the Chinese Communist Party, renounced their religion, they probably wouldn't have this, the issues that they're facing on an individual level. And so ultimately, again, all these things are very like interconnected, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay. So I think we have a sense of what human rights looks like. Let's turn now to the question of China. Carly, explain to me, why are we focusing on China and their human rights record as opposed to any of the other countries in the world that we could question their human rights record? Why is China important?
Well, right now I think we're talking about China not only because, like Bethany mentioned, they've got that major discrimination and internment of Muslim people, but also China it's a world power. It's one of the biggest countries in the world. It's one of the biggest manufacturing powers in the world. Look on anything in your house and you'll probably see made in China. But not only that, we're talking about them because since they are such a big world power, and they're also part of the UN, and they've also signed this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's a big concern because we are, as the United States, associating with them and relying on them to manufacture things for us. And not only that, we have like the struggle from like accusations of them being involved in presidential voting and elections. And so I think overall just the sheer size and involvement that we have with China is what makes their issues such a big conversation.
I definitely agree with Carly in that it's China's continuing to emerge as such a powerful unit in the world. And I think that another reason why we're looking at this in particular is because as Westerners, some of the violations that we're seeing are kind of unthinkable to us in our society. So like kind of forced sterilization, forced births, forced abortions, all three of those things on different ends of the scale are things that we in America, we debate, like you said, should women have the right to make those decisions for themselves? But in China, as we're seeing, like they're not even given the right to decide these; it's being decided for them. Again, like the detainment and the concentration camps that we're seeing, that's an unthinkable thing for us. And forced labor, the closing down and destruction of like religious places like mosques, stuff like this is things that I think we as a society see it as an extreme violation, whereas maybe in other areas where human rights are being violated, there are things that don't stick out as much, even if they should. I think the things that are happening in China are so shocking to many Westerners that this is something that people are starting to talk about more and more.
Carly had suggested a second ago that part of the problem, part of the reason why we have to be concerned is because we buy so much of their flashy stuff, or we've invested so much money into their economy. Do you think that American businesses are implicated in Chinese human rights records because of our relationship with them? Or do you think that actually by having Americans invested, we're maybe putting restraints on Chinese behavior? Luke, you look like you have a real opinion on this.
So I would say that, that is a very big issue. I feel like it makes people uncomfortable when they hear these things to think, well, I have this cheaply made article of clothing that was made there. I can buy a phone for this amount of money, whatever, and afford it. But again, it sort of has blood on your own hands, because we've heard of stories like people working in the Apple factories of like trying to commit suicide and whatnot. We've heard all these things. And so ultimately, it comes down to businesses that work there. We have international businesses that are based in the United States, and there's other countries that also have, businesses based in their countries, but that manufacture in China and various other East Asian countries as well. And so ultimately, it makes us uncomfortable, I would say. And, to have businesses move back is also very expensive. Our one of our associations in our government, I can't actually remember what it's called right now, actually went against and noted that they did not approve of China's a law that was being passed to give people labor union rights, because it would force our companies to actually adhere to better working conditions and whatnot. And so any of the rules that apply in the United States don't apply there, even though these companies are American based. And so they can essentially exploit the workers there and exploit the bad laws that they have.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I've seen just personally a lot of businesses, like fast fashion in particular. There's particular companies where people are starting to see, there's been like investigative journalists who have gone into these companies and worked and actually seen the conditions that these people are operating under. And although it's like horrifying to us to see like these 7-day-a-week work weeks and getting 1 day off a month, people are continuing to order from these places because it's cheap as a consumer. So while we're like, oh, this is such a big violation of human rights, how could they be doing this? And then 20 minutes later, you go and place an order for a Halloween costume because it's cheap and it's going to get to you quickly. So while people are concerned about the violation, I think when it's still a benefit to them, that's when the line gets blurry as to when should we actually try to put a stop to this while I'm still reaping the benefits of like their production.
I think it's very, to me, it's very reminiscent of the kafala system in the Middle East. But instead of, native companies exploiting foreign workers, we've got our foreign companies moving in there and exploiting the native workers for our gain instead of their gain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fair point. Okay, so let's take a step back. We're going to come back to this topic of our level of incrimination. Let's assume that at some point in the near future, maybe the next presidential election, maybe 2 presidential elections, the United States or Great Britain or the European Union were to decide that it wanted to try to intervene into the domestic affairs of China and get involved in their domestic human rights behavior. Are there any principles under international law, any authority by which, any power under the United Nations that allows a foreign power to intervene or interfere with the behavior of a government towards its own citizens? Anything that y'all are aware of?
I'm not necessarily specifically aware, so I'm not going to say yes or no or answer it directly in that nature. I know that there are like tribunals, there are courts, and of course, the Chinese government would have to consent to fall under their jurisdiction. And so ultimately, I don't know if they are under those jurisdictions, and so I don't have an answer for you on that. But there is possibility if they committed crimes against humanity or what have you against people that they could potentially face ramifications again, but I don't know if they're under the proper jurisdiction for that.
So that's a fair point. So if we were to be able to, and not we, the United States, but if the United Nations or if the International Criminal Court, the ICC, if they were able to successfully bring charges of attempted genocide by the Chinese government against the Uyghur people, then perhaps the individuals in the Chinese regime who were responsible for the acts of genocide could be charged. That's a fair point. But in terms of trying to change their behavior, I'm personally not aware of a lot of authority that's given to a country to directly intervene and say, you must do this thing, other than, or I will invade you or something like that. Okay, so given that, and like I said, I wasn't aware of any. I was maybe thinking that y'all might have done something. What powers or tools are available to a state? What powers or tools has the United States or other countries tried to use in the past when they've tried to change the human rights behavior of a foreign power?
So I noted that there are 3 ways from my research. And so you can place economic sanctions on a country. You can sort of do quiet negotiations, as they call it. And that's been fairly popular with the United States. Obviously, it's not necessarily effective. Or they can make public statements. And also a sort of last alternative that's will never be used with China, going back to their economic power, is literal military intervention. And all of these things, economic sanctions, for example, I read studies about Vietnam there's issues with economic sanctions, and this ultimately hurts the same people who are being exploited. They're going to be the ones paying the taxes in their country for the sanctions that we're placing. So it doesn't necessarily help. And also military intervention. There's a whole line of issues that comes with that, especially with the United States' ability to do it. Because we believe that, well, if they have an election, if we insert sort of democracy into this vacuum that we leave, everything's going to be fine. And it's not necessarily the same as inserting human rights into this area. So it's a very gray issue, I would say.
I thought that was interesting too when I was looking into it, that economic sanctions, even when they've been attempted to been put on China to try to kind of negate these things, it hasn't really been as successful as it might have been in other nations, or as successful as they wanted it to be. Same with military intervention.
Yeah, it would seem that if you want something like an economic sanction to work, either the other country is going to have to be so dependent upon you that the threat compels resistance, or you're going to have to be willing to accept the pain over a long period of time of the impact of those sanctions on you. I mean, I'm thinking about the decision of the United States to try to block oil imports from Venezuela, or block oil, and at the same time also try to block the sale of oil onto the global market from Russia. That only works if the United States is willing to pay $4 or $4.50 at the gas pump. And the minute that we begin to, as domestic consumers, to have a distaste for that cost, it just kind of goes away. And so I guess your argument, Bethany, is that so far China's conviction has outlasted that of the international community for most of these things. And
with China, you also have to look. I mean, they have as far as their economy, they have the largest buying power in the world, so they can essentially eat the sanctions and not really face any issues from it, honestly. And so that's another problem. Just saying that we're going to say we have sanctioned them, and it wasn't for human rights violations under the Trump administration. but ultimately they can just eat it and it's not that big of a deal. And also you have, so can you sanction, if it's more targeted? I know with Russia, recently this year, we've done a few more like targeted approaches to like the upper echelons of the government, they've seized people's assets and whatnot. And so, if you could do that, that's obviously very different than just sanctioning imports as a whole.
Could any of you ever see or foresee a circumstance where either Chinese behavior or the relationship between the United States and China reached the point where Americans as consumers would find it to be in their interests to pursue human rights records, even if it meant pain to us? Or do you think that all of this talk about stopping China from doing bad things is basically just rhetoric?
Personally, I don't see it as something that would ever happen unless it was like a direct threat of like war or something. I just don't think that a lot of Americans are able to see the bigger picture concerning human rights, and that they're more concerned of an individual basis. I mean, like you said, like sanctions would only work if consumers are willing to pay $4 a gallon for gas, and we've seen that that's just not acceptable for a lot of people. And I don't think unless it had a direct impact on the individual person in America that we would call for much action against it.
I would agree with Carly in that sense, and that I think until it's directly impacting every individual, it's not going to be something that people keep on their radar. Because again, like going back to the consumer things, people might recognize these violations and want to put a stop to it and want people to be able to experience and benefit from the upkeep of these human rights. But as long as they're continuing to benefit from the violation of those, they're continuing to benefit from this forced labor or these work hours, and they continue to get their products for the cheapest amount possible. I don't think that the majority of people are going to be willing to put their comforts aside to address the issues. I don't think so.
Luke,
Yeah, I would agree. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just asking if you basically agree.
Yeah, I would agree with all that.
So given where you are then, after having spent the last couple of weeks studying this topic, in addition to all the other work that you've done while you have been in college, do you think that it's possible for an external power to positively change a country like China? Or do you think it's actually more likely that there would be negative consequences, what the CIA used to call blowback? That in an attempt to try and fix China, you might actually make things a whole lot worse than what they currently are. What do you think is the more likely outcome?
I would say that based on the ways we've previously intervened in countries before, and that's mainly what my research was, to try and apply it to China. If our government directly intervened, it would not work well. We would face lots of issues. We'd probably create more issues within China than there already are. I raised an example of Libya when we had helped them get rid of their dictator Gaddafi. It inserted a government that was very weak, and there was still lots of human rights violations. It was actually worse than it previously was. And so if we continue on the path of our intervention methods as we have previously used, it will obviously be worse. I do think that potentially we can do something with our international corporations that are based their manufacturing sectors there. And I think you would have to target it in that specific way. If they increased, sort of the standards through their company, that would perhaps be the best way. And that might be the only way, but just blatantly trying to intervene would not end well.
I agree with Luke. I don't think our government directly intervening would work out. I do think if we had, like he said, international businesses or some NGOs jump in there and try to work hand in hand with the government of China on some of their issues, I feel like that would be a much better opportunity of outcome, but I don't think the government trying to personally make any changes would be effective.
I would agree, just because China is not really dependent on powers like the United States or other big powers at this time, because they are becoming such a big power themselves. Because they're not dependent on other countries, I do think that the intervention would lead to more pushback than it would lead to more benefit. If they were more dependent on us economically or for other reasons like that, I think maybe it would have a better chance at success. But because they're not, I don't think that it would be that successful.
You know, this is one of those topics that for the last 20 years, it seems like every time someone begins to approach the question of human rights and fixing the world, they come into it with such hope. And after a few weeks of study, they start to realize this stuff's really hard. So thank you very much for your very pragmatic evaluation of the situation. And thank you very much for joining me. And also thank you guys at home if you're joining us either live or if you're catching us later on Facebook or YouTube. Remember to like the channel so you're aware whenever we have new broadcasts. And if you're interested, please join us at the same time next week, where we're going to begin a new series, a multi-part series. We're going to be actually looking at American domestic affairs as we are coming out of the American election season. Specifically, we're going to be talking next week about the question of regulatory authority and whether or not Congress has ceded too much of its power to the executive branch. So until then, thank you very much for your attention and your time, and God bless.